This is Hana Mudaffar, and this is part of a series of lectures highlighting the main ideas in Pelagia Goulimari's book, Literary Criticism and Theory, From Plato to Postcolonialism. This session is on the last chapter, chapter 12, Poststructuralist deviations, mimicry, resignification, contrapunctual reading, the subaltern, signifying, and hybridity. Hélène Cixous' concept of écriture féminine, articulated in her 1975 essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, challenges Western metaphysics by disrupting binary oppositions such as body, mind, and masculine-feminine. For Cixous, women's writing is not limited to biological women, nor is it separatist. Rather, it is a utopian, excessive, and fluid mode of writing. Her style blends poetic, performative, and philosophical registers, creating a collage-like text filled with allusions and transformations. Cixous' textual strategy includes voler, meaning both to steal and to fly, capturing the movement and multiplicity of her prose. She employs a post-structuralist method of countersigning, echoing Derrida, and positions her writing as a form of catachresis or improper use. Écriture féminine is described as a series of fleeting identifications, brief identificatory embraces that resist containment. It is defined by speed, dispersion, and alterability, distancing itself from the Anglo-American academic norm of rigorously reference prose. In place of linear logic, she substitutes metaphorical, affective, and bodily language that defies academic propriety. Her references are elliptical, and her citations often anonymous, transforming scholarly discourse into poetic invention. Cixous' project is rooted in reclaiming the female body and its repressed desires as sources of creativity and resistance. She invokes Freud's polymorphous perversity to describe female sexuality not in terms of lack, but as multiplicity and excess. The hysteric symptoms, especially the loss of voice, are reinterpreted as forms of bodily writing and subversive self-expression. Dora becomes a feminist heroine, a voice of a phonic revolt, and a pioneer of écriture féminine through her embodied resistance. Cixous draws on psychoanalysis, Nietzschean affirmation, and Bataille's theory of excess to revalue women's unpaid and unseen labor. Through this, she imagines a non-capitalist, gift-based economy of female creativity, resistance through expenditure rather than accumulation. Figures like Woolf and Joyce are reclaimed for her vision, especially Molly Bloom's monologue, which she sees as a model of affirmative yes-saying. Yet she also critiques most women's writing for perpetuating stereotypical feminine traits, urging the destruction of the fault woman. The writing she values, whether by men or women, is rare, utopian, and almost subversive of patriarchal representational norms. In the end, her project is a form of radical misappropriation. Women's writing becomes a utopian rewriting of the entire Western tradition. Luce Irigaray, like Cixous, reimagines women's writing through a symbolic engagement with the female body, but she shifts the focus from visual representation to tactile experience as the foundation of feminine subjectivity. In her influential work, This Sex Which Is Not One, Irigaray reconfigures the vaginal lips as a polysemous metaphor for plurality, sensuality, and the fluid contiguity of self and other. This emblematic figure unsettles the traditional binary of activity and passivity and simultaneously undermines the Western valorization of vision as the privileged mode of knowledge. Irigaray proposes that women experience their bodies as inherently multiple, at least two, and this internal rationality makes possible new symbolic and textual forms. She advances mimicry as a feminist tactic, a deliberate, playful repetition of patriarchal discourse that reveals its internal contradictions and destabilizes its authority. Her readings of Freud and other canonical thinkers proceed through subversive ventriloquism, adopting their rhetorical posture while quietly unraveling their assumptions from within. While she has been criticized for essentializing femininity, Irigaray's rhetorical performance is better understood as a strategic catachresis, an intentionally improper usage meant to inaugurate a renewed ethical symbolic space for women. In this way, Irigaray's writing becomes a site of embodied critique and imaginative resistance, privileging touch, nearness, and relationality over abstraction and separation. Judith Butler's gender trouble intervenes in the debate on sexual difference by critiquing its conceptual dependence on heterosexuality. Drawing on Beauvoir, Butler asserts that gender is not a natural essence, but a performative effect of repeated discursive practices. These performances construct the illusion of stable gender identities, which societies work to enforce and regulate. Drag, for Butler, exemplifies the performativity of gender, parodying its constructed nature and exposing its contingency. She critiques the binary structure of gender and its enforcement through mechanisms like punishment, shaming, and erasure. Butler calls for an openness to resignification, a space where gender norms can be challenged, displaced, and multiplied. Her theory resists utopian or essentialist claims, embracing instead a politics of instability and fluid identity. In her view, there is no place outside discourse from which to speak. Instead, resistance must happen within and through discursive resignifications. This makes subversion unpredictable. What destabilizes norms in one context may reinforce them in another. Butler's later work turns towards intersectionality, critiquing feminist theories that privilege sexual difference over other axes of identity. She challenges Irigaray's framework for marginalizing race, class, and sexuality by insisting on the interdependence of all vectors of power. Drawing on the writings of Black feminists like Hazel Carby and Nella Larsen, Butler analyzes how race and gender are co-constructed. Her reading of Larsen's Passing uncovers the foreclosure of solidarity among Black women under the pressures of white supremacy and patriarchal uplift. She argues that Larsen exposes how dominant narratives silence Black women and make their resistance unreadable within existing discourses. Butler reads Talou, a revolutionary suicide, as a feminist speech act that resists both nationalist and patriarchal frameworks. Yet she remains cautious. Subversion is never fully noble or controllable, and representation always risks reinscription into dominant codes. Her call is for a vigilant, open-ended feminism that remains accountable to its exclusion and complicit power relations. Like Spivak, she stresses the ethical necessity of self-reflexivity in any theory that claims to speak for the marginalized. Eve Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet maps two central contradictions in the construction of modern sexuality and gender. First is the tension between a minoritizing view, only some people are truly gay, and a universalizing view in which everyone possesses same-sex potential. Second is the opposition between the inversion model, which sees gay identity as cross-gender identification, and the gender separatist model, which maintains same gender desire within existing identities. Sedgwick argues that both contradictions coexist, producing conceptual disorientation and social impasse. The closet, she insists, is not merely a private space, but a structural institution embedded in heteronormative assumptions. Coming out does not end the relation to the closet, but places the speaker in an endless negotiation with silence and exposure. Sedgwick's analysis reveals how institutionalized ignorance about homosexuality persists despite increasing visibility. Her Foucauldian approach emphasizes the entanglement of knowledge and sexuality, tracing how modern identities are produced by discursive contradictions. Despite her bleak outlook during the AIDS crisis, she sees hope in studying and unmasking the incoherences of these discursive regimes. Hortense Spillers, in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, radically reframes the historical experience of African American women as a process of symbolic ungendering. In contrast to white women, who suffered gender oppression within patriarchal structures, Black women were denied even the legal and cultural markers of gender. Under slavery, motherhood was rendered void, and the Black family outlawed to preserve the master's property rights. Spiller shows that the symbolic degendering of enslaved women turned them into commodities, stripped of familial or maternal recognition. The matriarchal figure, later blamed in American sociological discourses like the Moynihan Report, is rooted in this history of racialized dispossession. Rather than seek integration into white gendered norms, Spiller calls for a space to affirm Black female subjectivity on its own terms. This rearticulation of gender challenges both feminist and civil rights discourses that assume the universality of white womanhood. Her intervention foregrounds the necessity of developing frameworks that account for historical and racialized differences in gender formation. Following Spiller's excavation of the symbolic erasure of Black women under slavery, Edward Said turns to a different but parallel structure of exclusion, the discursive invention of the Orient under imperialism. In Orientalism, he demonstrates how a vast network of literary, scholarly, and political discourse systematically constructed the East as exotic, passive, and inferior. Drawing on Foucault's theory of discourse, Said argues that Orientalism operates as a mechanism of power knowledge that enables and justifies colonial control. This discourse does not merely describe the East, but actively produces it as a fixed, knowable object stripped of historical complexity or agency. Yet, unlike Foucault, Said maintains that individual authors retain agency and that close textual analysis can uncover resistance within seemingly complicit work. Literature, for Said, often enacts ideological contradictions, even as it participates in imperial thought. It may also gesture beyond its own assumptions. These moments of tension invite nuanced readings that move past binary judgments of guilt or innocence. Said thus challenges readers to confront the cultural mechanisms of empire embedded in even the most canonical texts. Expanding on Orientalism, Said develops contrapuntal reading as a method of holding together multiple, often conflicting historical and cultural perspectives within a single text. Contrapuntal reading requires the reader to remain attentive to both the dominant imperial voice and the voices of the colonized that it obscures or suppresses. His interpretation of Heart of Darkness exemplifies this method by foregrounding not only Marlowe's colonial vision, but also the narrative's own self-questioning structure. Adapting the musical concept of counterpoint, Said emphasizes the ethical importance of engaging with dissonant voices simultaneously, without forcing them into harmony. He resists the polarizing certainty of both neocolonial apologia and blanket anti-colonial condemnation, instead advocating for critical nuance. For Said, reading is not a neutral activity, but a politically and ethically charged encounter with the limits and implications of cultural representation. Contrapuntal analysis becomes a reparative act, making visible the histories that dominant narratives displace or erase. It also anticipates Spivak's insistence on the ethical difficulty of speaking for those structurally silenced by power. Said's method does not aim to resolve contradictions, but to hold readers accountable for recognizing and responding to what has been excluded. Beatrice Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak critiques the epistemic violence embedded in both colonialist and post-colonial discourses. Drawing from Derrida and Foucault, she argues that the subaltern, as the most marginalized figure, cannot be fully represented within dominant systems of knowledge. Spivak criticizes both Deleuze and Guha for assuming that the oppressed are transparent to themselves and readily knowable. Instead, she highlights the limits of intellectual representation and the impossibility of speaking for the subaltern without reinscribing power. Her reading of Paduri's Suicide becomes a case study in interpretive failure, a radical feminist act rendered invisible by familial and nationalist frameworks. Even Spivak's own reading, she admits, is the moot decipherment, a partial and necessary flawed intervention. She urges scholars to mark their positionality, reject missionary claims of recovery, and acknowledge the distance between themselves and the subaltern. The ethical task becomes one of unlearning privilege and resisting the impulse to stabilize the subaltern within academic discourse. In this way, Spivak performs a deconstructive gesture, gesturing toward what cannot be fully captured or translated. Spivak's notion of the subaltern continues to engage with the question of singularity, acts and voices that resist absorption into dominant categories. Her engagement with Derrida's counter-signature frames interpretation as a necessary, deferred, and partial act of translation. The story of Toulouse menstruating suicide resists the codes of nationalist sacrifice and romantic passion, functioning as a disruptive speech act. Yet Spivak insists that this act, while legible in hindsight, was refused at the time by its intended audience, including other women. The subaltern, in her view, speaks only in a mode that escapes capture, and any reading that claims to render it transparent is ethically suspect. Even when intervening critically, she warns against reifying the subaltern through well-intentioned scholarship. Her insistence on the instability of meaning parallels Butler's resignification and Derrida's deference, but centers specifically on postcolonial feminism. Spivak's position is deliberately uncomfortable. It insists on the impossibility of resolution and the necessity of political vigilance. Rather than offering consolation, her work exposes the structural violence of representation and the fragility of ethical critique. Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s The Signifying Monkey establishes signifying as a foundational African American rhetorical practice and critical mode of intertextuality. Tracing its origin to the Yoruba trickster figure Isu, Gates argues that African American literature is defined by repetition with a difference. Signifying inhabits a liminal space between the dominant literary canon and the Black vernacular, operating as both homage and critique. Gates distinguishes four types of signifying: tropological revision, formal innovation, hidden polemic, and affirmative homage, each exemplifying different rhetorical relations to tradition. Unlike Spivak's subaltern, Gates sees the African American text as self-theorizing and culturally legible, though long overlooked by racist literary assumptions. Figures like Hurston, Ellison, Morrison, and Walker signify on each other and the Western canon, shaping a distinct double-voiced aesthetic. Jazz, improvisation, Black sermons, and oral storytelling also serve as paradigms for literary signifying, embedding performance within the written word. Signifying, then, becomes a decolonial strategy, not through rupture, but through rhetorical indirection, parody, inversion, and mimicry. Gates positions Black literature as both within and against the Western tradition, creating a space of irreducible linguistic play. His method both affirms the distinctiveness of Black cultural forms and theorizes their transformative engagement with dominant discourse. Following Gates' theory of signifying as revision through rhetorical doubleness, Homi Bhabha develops a postcolonial vision of hybridity as the generative space of resistance. For Bhabha, subjectivity and culture emerge not from fixed origins, but from the in-between, zones of overlap where colonizer and colonized co-constitute identity. Hybridity disrupts binary oppositions by staging ironic repetitions that both mimic and displace dominant authority. Drawing from Derrida, Bhabha aligns hybridity with translation, a performative ethical act shaped by incompleteness and excess. He reframes community not as homogeneous, but as assembled across dissonance and translation, where solidarity forms through negotiation. This logic resists essentialist claim to purity, offering instead a politics grounded in articulation rather than identity. In Bhabha's view, minority positions are not merely marginal, but pivotal sites of theoretical rethinking and cultural intervention. Cultural translation becomes an interstitial practice that affirms opacity, ambiguity, and the irreducible singularity of each position. Bhabha's model of hybrid subjectivity anticipates Young's focus on resonance and dissonance as modes of ethical historiography. Robert Young maps the theoretical and political genealogy of postcolonial studies, constructing a method grounded in self-critique and historical accountability. In White Mythologies, he interrogates how Eurocentric historical narratives have effaced the contributions of the non-West, calling for a hybrid historiography. His method, indebted to Derrida and Levinas, emphasizes the ethical imperative of not subsuming the other within totalizing frameworks. Young contrasts fusion and contrafusion as modes of cultural hybridity. Resonance enables coalitional formation, while dissonance stages radical critique. Gates' Signifyin and Baba's hybridity exemplify dissonant forms of resistance, though Young also affirms moments of generative resonance. Both modes are necessary. Resonance without critique risks assimilation. Dissonance without connection risks nihilism. Young highlights the relevance of this oscillation for multiculturalism, which must navigate simultaneity, historical repetition, and ethical difference. His model of postcolonial historiography balances critique with reconstruction, foregrounding voices previously silenced or distorted. The goal is not merely to replace one canon with another, but to produce a flexible, dialogic mode of knowing. For Young, the interval between past and present is not stable. Historical forms repeat, mutate, and demand continuous ethical attention. In conclusion, Cixous and Irigaray theorize women's writing as bodily, excessive, and destabilizing, employing strategies of mimicry and metaphor to resist phallocentric logic. Butler reframes gender as performative field of resignification, critiquing the essentialist framework of earlier feminists and aligning with intersectional politics. Sedgwick's analysis of the contradictions in sexual and gender discourse exposes the entrapment of identity within institutionalized ignorance. Said's contrapuntal method models a reparative reading practice that resists binary oppositions and engages text as sites of contested meaning. Spivak insists on the impossibility of fully representing the subaltern, advocating ethical reflexibility and the acknowledgement of interpretive failure. Gates, Baba, and Young offer modes of hybridity, rhetorical, cultural, and historical, as tools of resisting hegemony and re-articulating marginalized tradition. Thank you for your attention.